There is a certain kind of silence that exists only in a house where everyone knows the truth but no one is permitted to speak it aloud. Not the silence of empty rooms or of sleeping children. Not the quiet of winter mornings before the birds begin to sing. This is something older and far heavier. The kind of silence that presses against the chest, that trails a person from room to room like a second shadow, one that outlives the people who created it and seeps into the walls themselves, into the wood and the plaster, into the portraits hanging in darkened hallways, where no candle is ever lit. In 1847, on a working cotton plantation, 12 miles southeast of Natchez, Mississippi, a woman named Nora was given an order that would slowly reshape the lives of every person on that property for the next 20 years. She was told to care for 2 children, to feed them, wash them, sing to them, and keep them alive. She was told this not as a request. She was told it the way a man directs a plow horse toward a field. What no one on that plantation fully understood, not the overseers, not the neighboring families who came to dine on Sundays, not the minister who blessed the house every Christmas, was the true nature of what was being asked of her. They would not understand it for many years. And when the understanding finally came, when the letters were opened and the documents were spread out on a courthouse table in the summer of 1866, the men who read them fell silent in a way that the witnesses in that room never forgot. One of them, a federal records clerk named Douglas Peel, later wrote about it in a personal letter that survived among his family papers. He described the moment as the slow collapse of something you had always believed was solid, like pressing your hand against a wall and discovering there is nothing on the other side. This is the story of Nora, of a plantation called Grayfield, and of 2 children who were raised inside a lie so carefully built that even they could not see it from within. This is the story of what Edmund Hale did, and what it cost everyone around him. And this is the story of how the truth, in the end, does not remain buried no matter how many years of silence are poured over it. Stay with us. Edmund Hale arrived in Adams County, Mississippi, in the spring of 1841, at 26 years old, with a letter of introduction from his father's lawyer in Charleston, South Carolina, and enough capital to purchase land and begin a modest cotton enterprise. He was not, by most accounts, a man who inspired instant trust. Neighbors who met him in those early years later described him in depositions collected 2 decades afterward in strikingly similar language, composed, deliberate, never entirely at ease. One woman, the wife of a nearby planter, wrote in a diary entry from 1842 that she found Edmund Hale to be a man who weighs his words before speaking and watches you as you hear them to see whether they have landed where he intended. He was not cruel in the loud, impulsive, theatrical way that some men were cruel. He was something quieter and in certain ways more difficult to define. He made decisions the way a chess player makes moves, with calculation that had begun long before the piece was touched, and with a careful indifference to the suffering of whatever piece was sacrificed. He purchased his land, 412 acres of rich, alluvial soil between 2 creeks, in March of 1841, from the estate of a deceased planter named Oakes, whose family had defaulted on debts gathered over 2 reckless decades. Edmund paid less than the land's full value. He knew it, and the Oakes heirs knew it, but the terms had been set by the court, and nothing could be changed. He renamed the property Grayfield, a name that suited it well. Not gray in the sense of despair, but gray like a sky that has not yet decided whether it will offer sun or storm. He built the main house during that first year and into the second. It was a 2-story structure with a wide front gallery and 4 tall columns that announced the property's ambitions without fully achieving them. It was a planter's house shaped in the pattern of many others in Adams County, large enough to suggest prosperity, restrained enough to suggest caution. Edmund Hale never built anything for pleasure. He built things to serve a purpose. By 1843, Grayfield had 31 enslaved people working both the cotton fields and the domestic duties of the house. Edmund had purchased most of them at auction in Natchez, a city that held some of the most active slave markets in the South during those years, a fact its wealthier residents regarded with a mix of civic pride and careful social distance. He was not careless in these purchases. He studied the listings the way he studied everything, methodical and without sentiment, searching for particular qualities that matched his particular needs. Among those he purchased in 1843 was a woman named Nora. She was 22 years old at the time of purchase. She had been brought to Natchez from a tobacco plantation in Virginia, part of a larger group sold when that operation fell into bankruptcy. The auctioneer's notes, which would later become part of the official record, described her as healthy, of sound constitution, skilled in domestic labor, reported to read and write. That final detail was unusual enough that Edmund Hale underlined it in the listing. He paid well above the average price for her. What the listing did not describe, because such things were never written down, was the person behind the facts. It did not say that Nora had a memory like a trap, that she remembered faces, conversations, and the exact order of events with an accuracy that sometimes unsettled those around her. It did not say that she was observant in the deep, sideways way people become observant when survival depends on reading a room before stepping inside. It did not say that she had quietly learned to read at the Virginia plantation, not through permission, but through proximity, watching the children of the house practice their lessons while she worked nearby, borrowing books left on tables and returning them before anyone noticed. Edmund Hale did not know all of this when he bought her, but he sensed enough to understand that she was someone useful to keep close. She was assigned to the main house. In the fall of 1843, Edmund Hale married a woman named Clara Weston, the third daughter of a land-poor but well-regarded family from Port Gibson. Clara was 20 years old, small-framed, with dark eyes, and a quiet manner that the county social circle sometimes mistook for shyness, though it was in truth something more guarded. She had grown up in a house where money was discussed in worried whispers behind closed doors, and she had learned, as children in such homes do, to read the emotional weather of a room with skill. She and Edmund were not, in the common sense of the word, a love match. The arrangement benefited both families, and both understood this clearly. Edmund required a wife from a respectable family to secure his social position in Adams County. Clara's family required the financial stability that marriage to an ambitious planter promised. These were not unusual terms for that time and place. What was less common was how clearly both Edmund and Clara understood those terms and never pretended otherwise. Clara moved into Grayfield in November of 1843. She and Nora met on the day of her arrival. Clara was led from the carriage into the main hall where the household staff had gathered to receive her. She walked along the line of faces as new mistresses did, briefly and with assessment, performing the authority expected of her. She paused longer at Nora than at the others, not in hostility but in recognition of something she did not yet have words to name. "You are Nora," Clara said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Clara studied her for a moment, then moved on. Later that evening, when the house had grown quiet and Edmund was in his study, Clara asked the housekeeper, an older enslaved woman named Ruth, about Nora. Ruth said she was skilled, quiet, and that Mr. Hale kept her on lighter indoor work. Clara remembered this. She remembered most things. Edmund managed his cotton business with the same cool efficiency he applied to everything. The crops were adequate, not remarkable, but steady. He was building something deliberate and gradual, and he moved with the patience of someone who understands that patience itself can be power. Clara managed the household. By the accounts of those who worked with her, she was a better manager than Edmund in domestic matters, more attentive to what required attention, less prone to the sharp impatience that marked her husband's style of instruction. She was not warm toward the enslaved people in the way some plantation mistresses performed warmth as a social virtue. She was consistent. She stated her expectations clearly. She did not change them without reason, and she did not invent excuses for punishment. In the harsh moral arithmetic of the plantation system, this did not make her good, but it made her, in daily life, somewhat less unpredictable than most. Nora served as Clara's personal attendant in those years. She assisted with the household, the accounts, which Edmund had assigned to Clara, and which Clara quietly shared with Nora, because, as she once said to Ruth, "She is the only one in this house besides me who can add." In the spring of 1845, Clara became pregnant for the first time. She lost the child at 4 months. In the fall of that same year, she conceived again. She lost that child at 6 months. The second loss was heavier. Edmund received the news in his study and did not speak of it. The doctor, a man named Ambrose Vickers, who managed much of the county's medical work from his office in Natchez, told Clara that there was no clear medical cause for the losses, and that sometimes such things happened without explanation. That many women endured such losses and still went on to give birth to strong and healthy children. He spoke with the practiced brightness of a man who understood that his patient required hope more than exact detail, and Clara accepted it with the gentle nod of a woman who had heard comforting words before and had learned to let them pass through her without holding them close. What shifted in Clara after the second loss was not something easily seen in her outward manner. She continued to run the household. She still attended the Sunday dinners the Hales hosted for the county's most respected families. She still spoke to Edmund across the table with the calm, careful exchange that passed for their version of married conversation. Yet something in the feeling of it had changed. A slight tightening, as if a door she had once kept partly open had now been drawn nearly shut, though not fully locked. Nora noticed because she was the sort of person who always noticed. In the spring of 1847, Clara Hale became pregnant for the third time. By then, everyone in the household understood, without speaking it aloud, that the situation was delicate. Edmund, who usually treated Amoti on all matters the way he treated a change in the weather, acknowledging them briefly before turning back to more practical concerns, was observed by several people to be unusually attentive during this pregnancy. He lessened Clara Aurara's social duties. He requested that Dr. Vickers make frequent visits to the house. He made it clear that Clara Aurara was to rest, and that Nora would attend to her personally and without interruption from other tasks. Clara did not ask for this extra care. She did not seem to desire it. Yet she accepted the arrangements in the same quiet way she accepted most decisions Edmund made. It was during this time, the late spring and early summer of 1847, that the event occurred which would not be understood for many years, and which, when it was finally uncovered, would alter the history of everything that followed. The facts, as they were later pieced together, are these. In March of 1847, before Clara Aurara's condition was widely known, another woman on the Grayfield plantation was also found to be with child. She was 26 years old. Her name was Nora. There is no record of how this came to pass that comes from Nora's own voice. No statement from her survives, if she ever gave one at all. What remains is written evidence assembled long afterward, speaking in the indirect language of ledgers and letters. A ledger note recording changes to her work duties in April of 1847. A letter from Dr. Ambrose Vickers to Edmund Hale, dated June 3, 1847, containing a passage later read aloud in a courthouse that caused at least 2 men present to rise abruptly from their chairs, and the testimony of 2 enslaved women, Hattie and Lou of Grayfield, both interviewed by a Freedmen's Bureau agent in the autumn of 1866, which established a sequence of events that no one who heard it could easily dismiss. What the documents suggest, and what the statements of Hattie and Lou make far more than suggestion, is that Edmund Hale had, through the winter of 1846 and the spring of 1847, made it known to Nora that she was required to submit to him. Hattie testified that Nora had confided this in fragments over several weeks, in the broken way people speak of things for which there is no safe language. Lou testified that she had personally seen Edmund Hale enter and leave the small room beside the kitchen where Nora slept more than once during the hours after the main house had gone dark. Neither woman offered further detail. Neither was asked to. The bureau agent who conducted the interviews, Patrick Corbin, whose notes remain in the Mississippi Freedmen's Bureau records in Washington, wrote that both women spoke with the steady clarity of people recounting facts they had carried for a long time and were finally relieved to speak aloud. The pregnancy that followed was Nora's. The children, not one but two, twins born in late October of 1847, were hers by the simple fact of biology, whatever else might be argued, and they were Edmund Hale's by that same fact. What occurred immediately after the birth is the part of the story most difficult to face directly, because it requires understanding a logic that, in that time and place, was not unusual, however monstrous it appears from any other angle. Clara Hale had given birth to a child 3 weeks before Nora, a daughter, alive and healthy, the first child she had carried to term. The relief in the main house was immense. Edmund received the news with what several observers described as an uncommon display of feeling. Not joy exactly, but something closer to the satisfaction of a man who has finally solved a problem that has occupied him for a long while. Yet Clarara's delivery had been dangerous. Dr. Vickers managed it through a long and difficult night, and the weeks that followed were marked by a weakness that worried the household. She was pale. She ate little. She did not nurse the infant herself because her body would not cooperate, and a wet nurse was arranged from among the women on the property. When Nora delivered her twins 3 weeks later, alone in the darkness, with only Hattie beside her, the boy was born first, then the girl. By morning, the boy was no longer in the room. Hattie's testimony about that moment remains one of the clearest passages in the entire Freedmen's Bureau record. She asked me where he was. I could not look at her. I said, Mr. Hale had come in the night. She asked what he had done. I told her he had taken the boy to the main house. She did not speak for a long time. Then she asked if the girl was still there. I said yes. She held the girl close against her and did not speak again until afternoon. By the following Sunday, it was publicly stated in the main house that Clara Hale had delivered not one child, but two. A girl named Josephine, born in early October, and a boy named Henry, whom she had delivered. It was said in a second labor 3 weeks later, which had been kept quiet for fear of the outcome. Dr. Vickers signed the documents. Whether he believed what he signed, whether he understood the arrangement he was participating in, or whether he convinced himself of a version that allowed him to complete the paperwork without examining it too closely, none of this was recorded. He died in 1859, before any of it was revealed, and carried whatever knowledge he possessed with him. The official record states this: Henry and Josephine Hale, twins, born to Edmund and Clara Hale, October 1847, Grayfield Plantation, Adams County, Mississippi. Clara Hale died of fever in January of 1849, 15 months after the birth. During those months she lived in an unusual relationship with the children. Observers noted, with the careless cruelty of people who do not understand what they are seeing, that she seemed more attached to Josephine than to Henry, that she held Josephine more readily, fed her more willingly in the early weeks, and that in the afternoons when she was strong enough to sit on the gallery, she kept Josephine on her lap with something that from the outside looked like simple maternal preference. What truly passed through Clara Hale's mind during those 15 months cannot be recovered. Yet, it is worth pausing over before the story moves forward. When Clara died in January of 1849, the children Henry and Josephine, just over a year old, required care. Edmund Hale did not grieve openly or for long. He accepted the condolences of the county in the proper manner, wore the correct mourning colors for the required period, and then returned to the management of Grayfield with the same focused efficiency that marked everything he did. He did not, in the months after Clarara's death, seek female company in any visible way, not from feeling, but from the practical understanding that remarriage too quickly would invite a kind of attention he preferred to avoid. The children needed tending. On the morning of January 29th, 1849, 9 days after Clarara's death, Edmund Hale called Nora to his study. She came. He told her that she would now be responsible for the care of the children, Henry and Josephine. She would move from the servants' quarters to the upper floor of the main house, to the room beside the nursery. She would be with them during the day, and available through the night. She would manage their feeding, their clothing, their early lessons. She would answer to him and to no one else in matters concerning them. What he said in that room and what she answered was not witnessed. No record exists. What the record exists, what the record does contain is what followed. Nora moved upstairs as, each morning, she entered the nursery before dawn. She dressed them. She fed them. She carried them through the house and along the galleries in the long afternoons, when the light turned the cotton fields a heavy shade of gold. She sang to them in the evenings, songs the children would remember in some form for the rest of their lives, without understanding why those melodies carried something that other songs did not. Josephine had eyes the color of deep water. Henry possessed a laugh that began silently and then slowly warmed into sound, like something coming to life from within. They were different in nearly every way, she quiet and watchful, he open and loud. In this they perhaps reflected the complicated inheritance of what they were, though no one at Greyfield spoke of that resemblance, not even in private thought. Nora's own daughter, the twin who had not been taken, was called Pearl. She remained with Nora after that October night, and grew up in the quarters, watched over by Hattie and Lou, when Nora was in the main house, which was almost always. Pearl was not permitted inside the main house. Edmund made no formal declaration of this rule. It was simply understood, as most rules at Greyfield were understood, without needing to be spoken aloud. Understood, not spoken aloud, but as fully present as the very walls of the house itself. Nora saw Pearl in the evenings, when she was allowed to walk to the quarters for the short hours between supper and nightfall. When she could, which was not often, she carried Pearl back to her own small room. She watched her daughter grow the way people watch something from far away, able to see the outline, unable to reach out and hold it. She raised Edmund Hale's children. She raised her own child of her blood. She could never speak that truth. The years at Greyfield between 1849 and the early 1860s were, in the record that remains, years of an unusual and careful arrangement. Edmund Hale managed his plantation, expanded it slightly, and kept up the social and professional life of a successful county planter. He attended church regularly. He hosted neighbors for dinner. He served on the county agricultural committee. He was known in the circles that included him, a respected man, not especially famous, not especially extraordinary. He was the kind of man who stands in the middle distance of history, visible in documents, but rarely at the center of events. Henry and Josephine grew older. By the reports of those who met them, neighbors, the minister, the tutor, Edmund, finally hired from New Orleans, they were considered unusual children in a way people found hard to explain, yet felt the need to mention. They were described as observant, reserved, seeming older than their actual years. The tutor, a Frenchman named Gaston Turley, wrote to a colleague in 1856 that his two students at Greyfield were the most curious children I have taught, not because of their lessons, which are satisfactory, but because of their manner, which is like people who have learned to study a room before stepping inside it. He did not know he was describing in both of them the trait they had inherited from their mother, Baya. Henry was more openly inquisitive. He asked constant questions of the tutor, of the men who came to discuss business with Edmund, of the workers in the fields when he was old enough to walk that far. Edmund regarded this habit with the steady, mild impatience of a man who saw questions as wasted effort unless they produced something useful. Josephine watched more than she spoke. She watched Nora. She had watched Nora for as long as she could remember. She watched her in the quiet way children watch the person who feels most real to them, most steady, before they have words for attachment or the fear of losing it. Nora had bathed her, fed her, held her during storms when thunder frightened her, and sat by her bed when sickness came. Nora had taught her the names of the birds outside the nursery window, the names of wildflowers near the eastern fence, and the exact way to fold the edge of a pie crust so it would hold together. Josephine never called Nora mother. She called her Nora, as custom required. Yet there was something in the way she spoke the name, a weight, a closeness, a lack of distance that several people noticed over the years without knowing what to make of it. In 1853, when Josephine was 6 years old, she first saw Pearl. By then, Pearl lived in the quarters in a small house, managed together by Hattie and Lou, two older women with no children of their own. Who had raised Pearl from infancy with the deep care of people performing a task that mattered more than they were allowed to admit. Pearl was small for her age, yet full of quick energy, sharp-eyed, with a stillness that came over her when she was thinking, making her appear older for a brief moment. Josephine had gone to the quarters to find Nora one afternoon, when Nora stayed later than usual. She slipped out of the main house without telling anyone, which she sometimes did with the quiet skill of a child who had learned which floorboards did not creak. She found Nora standing in the doorway of Hattie's house, holding Pearl, who had cut her hand on a strand of fence wire. Nora was wrapping the small hand with a strip of cloth. Pearl was very still, watching Nora's face instead of her own injured hand, the way children look at the person they trust when pain comes. Josephine stopped at the edge of the yard. She studied Pearl for a long moment. Then she looked at Nora. Nora saw her. Something passed over Nora's face. It was quick, but not so quick that Josephine missed it. Josephine was 6 years old and had been studying Nora's expressions for all of those 6 years. She caught it the way you catch a sound not meant to travel. "Who is she?" Josephine asked. "Her name is Pearl," Nora answered. "She was hurt. I am fixing it." "Does she belong here?" "Yes." Josephine looked at Pearl again. Pearl returned the look with the steady, unsentimental gaze of a child who had already learned that the world requires direct seeing. "She looks like you," Josephine said. Nora did not reply. Bye. That evening, Josephine told Henry about Pearl. Henry began asking questions at once. How old was she? Where did she stay? Who were her parents? Josephine said she did not know. Henry said they should find out. Josephine said nothing further. She was only 6, yet she had already begun, in a way she could not name, to sense that there were things at Greyfield that followed a different set of rules than the ones spoken aloud. The 1850s moved forward with the slow weight that decade carried in the American South, a time of great material success for men like Edmund Hale, built upon a system that was increasingly challenged in the wider world. Edmund knew the political climate. He read newspapers carefully. He attended meetings in Nages, where landowners debated fiercely what rights were theirs and what forces threatened to take those rights away. He was not driven by intense political passion, but he understood danger, and by the middle of the 1850s he judged that the danger was real. He made practical decisions. He shifted more of his wealth into land instead of paper notes. He kept his labor force steady and did not expand it greatly. He kept Greyfield's cotton work as self-contained as possible, reducing reliance on supply lines that passed through the more unstable markets of New Orleans. In 1855, he sent Henry away to school. The school was in Nashville, a respected institution that prepared young men for law, medicine, or plantation management. Edmund told Henry that the son of a planter required proper education and that Nashville provided what Mississippi did not yet offer. Henry was 8 years old. He did not openly object. He had learned, as children of distant and controlled men sometimes do, that protest was energy better saved. The night before Henry left, he found Nora in the kitchen. She was settling the fire for the night, performing the low, automatic work that hands complete while the mind travels elsewhere. Henry sat on the stool by the back door and watched her. He was 8, already tall, his serious face becoming even more serious when he felt something he could not express. "Will you remember what I look like?" he asked. Nora set down the iron poker and turned toward him. "I will remember," she said. "Are you sure?" "I have never forgotten a single face in my life," she replied. "Not one." Henry nodded. He seemed to want to add more, but he did not. After a moment he rose and went back inside. Nora remained in the kitchen for a long time after he left. With Henry gone, the balance inside the main house shifted. Edmund was more visible, which did not lessen the loneliness of the house. It changed the kind of loneliness. A large room with one person inside can feel lonelier than an empty one, because the emptiness has a name. Josephine grew during those years of her father's close presence into a young woman who was, by nearly everyone's account, difficult to understand. She was not cold. She was not unkind. She did not create trouble through temper or carelessness. She was something more unusual. She was remarkably composed for someone who clearly felt deeply. She possessed the rare quality, especially at a girl of 12, 13, 14, of listening to a conversation with full attention, while also visibly thinking about something entirely separate from what was being said. Her father found this quality unsettling. He was a man who managed others by reading them, and Josephine was not easy to read. He preferred Henry in the way men who prefer clarity favor the child, who is simpler to understand. During those years, Josephine stayed close to Nora, in a way no one could openly call improper. Nora was her attendant, her instructor in household skills, present wherever domestic tasks were being done. The structure of the relationship was exactly what society expected. The enslaved woman caring for the planter's daughter. The structure was correct. Yet beneath that structure something else had been growing for years, and by the time Josephine reached 13 or 14, it had grown too large to fit neatly within that shape. Josephine asked questions quietly, never in Edmund's presence. In the evenings, in the kitchen, in the upstairs hallway, when the house had grown quiet, and the two of them handled the small, steady work that keeps a home running, mending clothes, folding linens, checking lamp wicks. She asked about the plantation in Virginia, where Nora had once lived. She asked about the people there. She asked about Nora's mother, what she had been like, whether Nora remembered her clearly. She asked about Pearl slowly, over many months, never all at once, adding one question here, another there, with the patient sideways movement of someone solving a puzzle without the picture on the box. Nora answered with care. She was always careful. She had been careful for so long that carefulness had become the usual setting of everything she did. Not fear, but exactness. The exactness of someone who has spent years calculating how much truth is safe to speak aloud. She told Josephine about Virginia. She described the flat fields and the smell of tobacco and the pale gray, mean awnings of the eastern fall. She spoke of her mother with a seriousness that Josephine understood even then meant more than simple words. She said that her mother had been a woman who noticed small things, that she remembered faces and names and the precise order of events, and that she had passed this gift on, though to whom she did not say. Josephine held on to that. In the summer of 1858, when Josephine was 11 and Pearl was 10, though they did not know they were nearly the same age, because Pearl's birth had never been written in any record available to the children of the main house, Josephine came to the quarters again. This time she came on purpose. She waited for an afternoon when Edmund was in Natchez, which he visited every 2 weeks for business. She told the housekeeper she was going to walk along the eastern fence line, which she sometimes did, but instead she walked to the quarters. Pearl was sitting in the yard outside Hattie's house, sorting dried beans into a bowl. She looked up when Josephine turned the corner, and she did not jump. She simply looked, the way she always looked, with direct and steady eyes that had struck Josephine the first time she saw them. Josephine sat down in the yard without being asked. "I'm Josephine," she said. "I know who you are," Pearl replied. "What do you know about me? I know you live in the main house. I know your name. I know Nora takes care of you." Josephine studied her. "Nora takes care of you, too." Pearl lowered the bowl of beans slowly. "She's not supposed to tell anyone that." "She didn't tell me. I worked it out." Pearl looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the beans again and continued sorting. "What else did you work out?" Pearl asked. Josephine did not answer right away. She watched Pearl's hands, small and deft and quick, moving through the beans, pulling out the soft ones, and setting them aside. "I don't know yet," Josephine said at last. "I don't know yet," Josephine said, at last. "That's why I came." If you already feel that this story is leading you somewhere you cannot quite see, you are right. What we are about to reach is the part that took 20 years to come to light. So stay with us. Henry Hale returned from Nashville in 1859. 18 years old, educated in the way Southern schools of that time trained their students, in law, in the running of agricultural enterprises, and in the political ideas of a region that felt more and more threatened from the outside. He was not, however, exactly what the school had expected to produce. He came home changed in a way Edmund noticed at once, and regarded with the focused and controlled concern of a man who sees an unexpected variable in his plans. Henry asked questions he had never asked before, or he asked them in a different tone. He asked about the management of the labor force with a level of detail that was unusual, not in the usual plantation sense, not about efficiency or output, but about people, about names and histories, and where they had come from. Edmund told him to speak with the overseer, a man named Doss, who kept the labor records. Henry spoke with Doss, and then he spoke with Ruth, who by then was the oldest person at Grayfield and had been there since before Edmund bought the property. And then, quietly, he spoke with Nora. What passed between Henry and Nora during those conversations in the fall and winter of 1859 is not directly written down. There are fragments in Henry's later letters, in testimony gathered in 1866, and in a journal Henry began that year, the pages of which survived only in part. The fragments suggest a series of talks that moved slowly over weeks from general matters to specific ones, and that finally arrived at a place neither of them had openly named as the destination, but which Beau may have understood was where they were headed. He had grown up somewhat removed from Grayfield, at a school in Tennessee, where the discussions were broader than those common in Adams County, Mississippi. He had heard things, he had read things, in the particular way of young people who think carefully and are given time to think. He had formed a set of questions about his own life that he did not yet know how to face directly. The question he kept returning to was, why did Nora look at him the way she did? It was not a feeling he could easily define. It was not blame. It was not bitterness. It was not even the open tenderness of a mother freely shown, which he had seen in other women with their children. It was something more contained, more tightly held, like an emotion folded in on itself, so many times that it had become very small and very heavy. What you could see of it was only the outline of something whose full size you could not measure. He began to notice details he had ignored in childhood, the way children in comfortable houses often ignore the furniture around them. It is simply there, part of the fixed reality of the place. He began to notice Pearl. Pearl was a leaven that fall, living in the quarters, sharp and self-possessed. Henry had known she existed. He knew everyone at Grayfield by name because he was the kind of person who remembered names. But he had not truly looked at her until that fall. When he did, he felt something shift in his chest that he could not explain. He wrote about it in his journal in a single indirect sentence that has been preserved. There is a girl in the quarters named Pearl, whose face I find I cannot stop thinking about, not from any feeling of that sort, but from the sense that I am looking at something I have seen before in another place. He did not write what followed, or if he did, those pages are missing. By 1860, the political situation in Mississippi was taking the attention of every man who had anything to lose, and Edmund Hale's attention was no different. The presidential election of November 1860 brought the result that the South's more extreme voices had been predicting and partly shaping for years. By December, South Carolina had declared itself out of the Union. By January 1861, Mississippi followed. Edmund Hale attended the state convention. He was not a delegate, but he was present in Jackson when the Ordinance of Secession was signed, standing among the crowd of planters, merchants, and lawyers who had gathered to witness what they believed was either the start of a righteous struggle or the beginning of a disastrous mistake, depending on where they stood in the room. Edmund stood among those who saw it as a disastrous mistake, not for moral reasons, but for practical ones. He wrote to his brother in Charleston that January, in a letter that still survives, "I have never believed that what is right is always what is wise. But in this case, I find that neither condition has been met. We are stepping into a fire because certain men have persuaded us the fire will not burn." He went nonetheless. He sent Henry, who joined in the second year of the war as a commissioned officer in the Confederate infantry, because there was no other choice that did not bring consequences worse than going. At Grayfield, the household drew inward around those who remained: Edmund, Josephine, Nora, and the smaller domestic staff left behind when many of the male workers were taken into labor battalions by the Confederate Army. It was during the war years that the relationship between Josephine and Pearl stopped being the careful negotiated arrangement it had been throughout childhood and became something more open. Josephine was 14, then 15, then 16. Pearl was nearly the same age, almost to the week. They had grown up 200 yards apart, one in the main house and one in the quarters. The invisible wall between those 200 yards, a wall built not of wood or brick but of the entire plantation system, had been the central fact of their lives. The war changed the structure of daily life at Grayfield in ways that the broad political language of the conflict could not fully describe, with Edmund spending more time in Natchez on business and correspondence, with the overseer gone to war, with daily operations shifting under new pressures. The strict enforcement of every boundary became harder to maintain. Pearl began to come into the kitchen of the main house, not because she was invited, but because she came, and Nora, who was there to see her arrive, did not send her away. It is important here to pause and consider. Nora, not as she appears in records, as a name in an auction list, a presence in other people's accounts, a figure whose importance is measured by what was done to her and what she carried because of it, but as a person who spent 19 years navigating a reality that demanded from her a level of endurance most people never have to discover within themselves. She had come to Grayfield at 22. She was now in her early 40s. She had spent every one of those years inside the clear and terrible knowledge of what had happened to her, and of what she was doing each day in the nursery, then in the hallways, then at the kitchen table, and of what it meant, and of what she could never say. She had raised 2 children she could not name as her own. One of them she had been beside every day. She had watched Josephine become who she had become, the sharp-eyed, quiet girl who noticed everything, who asked questions. Wire, one, who had sat in the yard outside Hattie's house with Pearl and sorted beans as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, as if the vast and rigid structure of Grayfield's hierarchy was something she could simply step outside of, even if only for an afternoon. And Nora had watched Pearl grow up in the quarters. She had watched her from that painful middle distance, the close far away that is worse than absence, because it holds everything. Absence holds nothing, but this held the added weight of presence, of nearness, of being able to see and even touch, and still not be able to name why you are touching. She had made her choices inside a world that did not admit she had any choices at all. Somewhere in those first long years she had decided that what she could offer her children, both of them in their very different ways, was exactly what her own mother had given her: the quality of attention, the skill of seeing clearly, the habit of reading a room before speaking. She had given them this not through long talks, but through example, the way the strongest things are passed down. She had watched Henry grow into a young man who asked the necessary questions, and she had watched Josephine grow into a young woman who already guessed some of the answers. He had watched Pearl grow into a girl with iron in her spine and steady eyes, and the rare kind of patience that is not passive but gathered over time, patience as a form of readiness. What she had not given any of them, because she could not, was the plain fact of herself. The sentence, "I am your mother," the statement that would have rearranged everything they believed. She did not know if she would ever be able to give them that. She did not know what the world would look like by the time it was safe to speak it, or if safe was even a real category. She waited. In the spring of 1863, with the war entering its most violent phase and the Union Army moving through the Mississippi River corridor, Edmund Hale made a decision that revealed something about his nature that the ordinary routines of peacetime had partly hidden. He chose to move, not to leave Mississippi forever. He was not ready to accept that the situation was beyond repair, but to move certain things, mostly documents, his ledgers, his land records, the deed papers, the letters with his lawyers, his ledgers, his land records, the deed papers, the letters with his lawyers, and the financial papers that represented what he had built over 20 years. He carried them from the main house to the overseer's cabin, which stood on the far edge of the property, away from the river road, less visible to any advancing soldiers. He did this himself over 2 days in March, and he told no one on the property what he was doing or where the items had been taken. He locked the overseer's cabin and kept the key. Pearl found the key in August. This needs some explanation. Edmund had developed in middle age the habit of keeping his keys on a ring that he carried in his coat pocket. Everyone at Greyfield knew this, the way personal habits of people in power become known through daily closeness and the need to observe. He kept the ring in his right coat pocket. He had done so for years. In August of 1863, Edmund Hale became ill, not fatally ill, but serious enough. He was 50 years old and had been driving himself hard through the strain of the war years, and his body protested in the form of a fever that kept him in his room for 9 days. During those 9 days he stayed in his bed, his coat hung on the chair. The coat remained in the room, which Nora entered twice each day to bring meals, change sheets, and manage the sick room. She did not take the key. She would never have taken the key. But on the 5th day of Edmund's illness, when she came to gather the breakfast tray, she saw the key ring on the floor beside the chair, fallen, likely when the coat had slipped. She picked it up. She placed it on the table beside the bed within Edmund's reach. She did not study the keys longer than the moment required. But Pearl, who had been standing in the hallway when Nora stepped out of the room, had seen the keys in Nora's hands for the brief second before they were set down again. And Pearl, who had a sharp memory for faces and names and exact sequences of events she had inherited without knowing it, noticed the shape of the ring and the number of keys attached. And Pearl, who had grown up on the property and knew every building on it, including the overseer's cabin that had been shut and locked since March, understood something. She was 16 years old. She had learned from those who raised her that patience was preparation. On a September afternoon, when Edmund had recovered and traveled to Natchez for business, Pearl went to the overseer's cabin. The door was locked, but the window on the north side had a latch that had never worked properly, and Pearl had known this since she was 12, because she had once hidden in that cabin during a thunderstorm and had entered through that same window. She climbed through it again. She found the documents. At 16, she was not an expert reader of legal and financial papers, but she could read. Nora had taught her in the same quiet, careful, sideways way that Nora herself had learned, passing knowledge in small pieces and in silence, and she could read well enough to understand that what she held mattered. She moved through the ledgers quickly because she did not have time to read every page, and because she was searching for something particular, though she could not have explained exactly what. She examined the deed papers. She opened a stack of letters, their edges brown with age and tied with a piece of twine that she untied gently and tied again when she finished. The letters were from Dr. Ambrose Vickers. There were 9 in total, covering the years 1847 to 1853. Pearl read the first 3 before she fully grasped what she was reading. She read all 9 before she set them down. She tied the twine back around them in the same careful knot. She climbed out the north window. She walked back to the quarters. She went to Hattie's house and sat on the step in the September light and did not speak for a long while. Hattie came to the door and saw her there. "What happened?" Hattie asked. Pearl looked up at her. "I think," she said slowly, "I need to speak to Nora." This was the moment. You could feel it. That particular September afternoon in 1863, in a small house at the edge of a Mississippi plantation, when a 16-year-old girl sat down with what she now knew. The conversation between Pearl and Nora took place that evening. It happened in the small room beside the kitchen, the room that had been Nora's for 20 years. The room that had been Nora's for 20 years, the room so close to the main house that on quiet nights you could hear the specific creak of the floorboard at the top of the stairs. Pearl came after dark, which was allowed because Pearl was known to visit Nora in the evenings. Of the arrangements at Grayfield that existed without ever being formally named. Pearl sat on the stool. Nora sat on the edge of her cot. They were in lamplight, the small room close around them. Pearl told her what she had read. She spoke about the letters, about the dates, about what Dr. Vickers had written. She did not bring the letters with her. She had returned them exactly as she found them, because she was 16 and already thinking several steps ahead. But she carried their memory and laid it out in her patient, orderly way, presenting what she had already arranged in her mind. When Pearl finished, Nora was very still. The lamp cast light across the wall. Outside in the quarters, someone was playing a low repeating figure on a banjo, barely heard, more sense than sound. "How long have you known?" Pearl asked. "I have known since the beginning," she said. Pearl looked at her. "Did they know?" "Henry and Josephine." No. "Does Josephine suspect something?" Nora thought about this. "She suspects there is something to know. She has felt that for years, but she does not know what that something is." Pearl was quiet. "Then what are we going to do?" "We are not going to do anything yet," Nora said. "We are not going to do anything yet," Nora said. "We are going to be careful. The war changes things." Nora nodded. "But it does not change what is safe and what is not." "Not yet." Pearl looked at her hands. "Those letters, if someone who understood them, read them?" "Yes," Nora said. "So we need to leave them where they are." "So until we understand more," Nora replied. "Yes." She studied Nora's face in the lamplight, the face she had looked at her whole life, the face she had always read more easily than most, now beginning to understand why. "Why did you never tell me?" Pearl asked. The question was simple and enormous at once. Nora held it for a moment before answering. "Becca, use telling you would have made you carry it," she said. "You were a child. I would not place that weight on a child." "Now, no," Nora said softly. "You are not." Pearl sat in silence. The banjo had stopped. The night was very still. "I am angry," Pearl said at last, not loudly, just stating something true. "I know." At him? Yes, not at you." Nora did not reply. She reached across the narrow space between them and took Pearl's hand and held it. That was all that was possible in that moment, in that room, in that world. It was not enough. It had never been enough. But it was what existed, and Nora held that hand with the same careful, steady grip with which she had held everything that mattered and could not be held openly. Henry Hale returned from the war in the spring of 1865. He came back, altered in the way men return from wars that lasted 4 years and ended in defeat, carrying something inside that had no name in everyday speech, something that showed in the set of his jaw, in the careful slowness of his movements, and in the quality of his silences, which had once been thoughtful and were now heavier than that. He was 24 years old. He had been at Shiloh. He had been at Vicksburg. He had been at other places where the ground remembered what happened there, the fall of Atlanta and the long retreat through Georgia in the winter of 1864, and he had done all of this as a young officer in an army that by 1864 was fighting a war it could not win against a clock that was steadily running out. He arrived at Grayfield on a Thursday morning in April, 2 weeks after Appomattox. Edmund was standing on the gallery when Henry came up the road. They looked at each other across the space between the road and the steps, and then Edmund walked down and they stood together for a moment before going inside. Henry found Nora in the kitchen. She turned from tea. He stove when she heard him enter, and she looked at him with the same expression he had been trying to explain to himself for 5 years, that tight, compressed look that held too much beneath the surface it occupied. And he thought, not for the first time, that he needed to understand what that expression truly meant. "I'm home," he answered. He sat down at the kitchen table the way he had sat there as a boy. Because some things the body remembers no matter what the years have done to the rest of you. "Is everyone here?" he asked. "Pearl is here," she said. "Hattie and Lou." He nodded. "And Josephine." "And Josephine." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nora, I have some things I need to ask you." Nora turned back toward the stove. "All right," she said. "Not yet," he replied. "When there is time, when there is room for it, there will be time," she said. Emancipation came formally to Mississippi with the end of the war. The legal structure that had organized Grayfield for 24 years dissolved in those weeks, and in its breaking apart it produced something that was not immediately freedom, because the systems and dependencies and arrangements of the plantation did not disappear as quickly as the words of the law, but for the first time it created a situation with different possibilities than the one that had existed the day before. What the change created at Grayfield in the immediate term was a kind of suspended uncertainty. Edmund Hale, who had built his entire life around the management of this exact property and this exact operation, found himself at 60 years old in a position that no amount of careful patience had prepared him for. He was not a man who displayed fear, but he was for the first time in anyone's memory on the property. A man who did not seem to know what move to make next. Nora stayed. Pearl stayed. Josephine stayed. Henry stayed. This was not, for most of them, entirely a choice. In the simple meaning of the word, the realities of 1865 in rural Mississippi offered very few immediate options for people who had spent their whole lives on one plantation and had nowhere clear to go and no resources separate from the place. But the texture of the staying had changed, and everyone on the property felt this even without the language to describe it clearly. In the summer of 1865, a Freedmen's Bureau office opened in Natchez. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was the federal agency created in the final months of the war to manage the transition of formerly enslaved people into legal freedom, to negotiate labor contracts, to settle disputes, and to gather testimony. It was underfunded and short-staffed, operating in an atmosphere of deep hostility from much of the white population of the South. But it existed, and it represented for the first time a federal authority with at least a stated interest in the rights of black Southerners. Pearl heard about the Bureau from a man named Dawson, who was traveling through Adams County that summer, visiting plantations and explaining to the newly freed people what the Bureau was and what it might do. Pearl was 18. She was one of the few people on the property who could read, a skill she had kept quiet for most of her life, because the world she had grown up in did not reward such abilities in the people it wanted to control. She went to Natchez in September. She did not tell Edmund. She told Nora. Nora said, "Be careful. Come back before dark." Pearl went with Hattie's son, a man named Deacon, who was 20 and had been freed from a neighboring plantation and was moving through the same strange new landscape of official freedom in a place that had not yet decided whether to accept it. At the Bureau office she met the agent, Patrick Corbin. She told him what she knew. She did not tell him everything. Not yet. Not in that first meeting. She shared enough to establish that she possessed information connected to the legal history of a specific property in Adams County, and that this information might matter to questions of inheritance and documentation that the Bureau was already beginning to face in the reshaping of land and labor arrangements in the region. Corbin was about 35 years old, from Vermont, with the careful and deliberate manner of someone who had trained as a lawyer before the war and had taken this assignment because he believed the work was important. He listened to Pearl with full attention. He asked her to return. She came back 4 times over the next 6 months, each time bringing more detail, building slowly toward the complete account. Hattie and Lou gave their testimony in January 1866. Deacon helped arrange additional interviews, and Henry, who had by this point had several of those long conversations with Nora that they had both been moving toward since his return, gave his own statement in the spring of 1866. Henry's account is the most remarkable document in the record, not because it is the most detailed. Hattie and Lou are more exact, and Pearl is the most organized, but because of who is the most organized, but because of who is giving it, and what it cost him, and what it meant. He sat in Patrick Corbin's office in Natchez on a Tuesday morning in April 1866, and he told the truth about what he had come to understand about his own life. I believe that the woman named Nora, who was enslaved at the Grayfield plantation owned by my father Edmund Hale, is my mother and Pearl's, and that Josephine's mother is the same. I believe that what was presented to the county and to Clara Hale and to the two of us for all of our lives was a fabrication, and that the documents in the overseer's cabin at Grayfield, which I have now examined with my own eyes, confirm this. Corbin wrote this down in his neat and careful hand. "How long have you known this?" he asked Henry. Henry was silent for a moment. "I've suspected it," he said, "since I was 18. I think I have known it in the way of knowing things you cannot say, since I was a child." The summer of 1866 brought the confrontation that the previous 20 years had been slowly building toward, in the way that pressure builds when it has nowhere to escape but continues to gather. Edmund Hale was summoned to the Natchez courthouse in June of 1866. The Freedmen's Bureau did not have criminal authority over the events in question. The legal landscape was complex, and the specific nature of what Edmund Hale had done did not fit neatly into any single legal category that the law of 1866 had clearly defined. But the Bureau had the power to compel testimony, to collect and register documents, and to create an official record that would remain in the Federal Archive. Edmund came to the courthouse. He was 61 years old, thinner than before, with the controlled and unreadable expression that had defined him in every room of his life. He sat across a table from Patrick Corbin and two other Bureau officials, and he was shown the letters from Dr. Vickers. He read them without visible reaction. Corbin asked him to explain the contents. Edmund was silent for a long moment. "But no," then he said. Dr. Vickers was not always precise in his language. Corbin placed the third letter on the table, the one dated November 2nd, 1847, with the passage that left almost nothing open to interpretation. It discovered Molst and looked at Edmund. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I want to speak plainly about what we are doing here and why." Edmund looked back at him. "The people named in these documents have given testimony." Corbin said. "The record we are assembling is not a criminal trial, but it is a federal record, and it will remain. What we are asking you today is whether you wish to add to it, or whether you prefer to leave it as it stands." Edmund said nothing for a moment. He looked at the letters on the table. He had kept those letters for 19 years in a locked cabin on his property, and it must have occurred to him then, as it must have occurred to him when Pearl found the window, that keeping a thing is not the same as protecting it, that a thing locked in a cabin is still a thing in the world, still something that can be reached. "I would like to speak to a lawyer," he said. He was entitled to do so, and he was permitted to do so, and the session ended. Edmund Hale died in January of 1867, before any further legal action was taken. He died at Grayfield in the room where he had slept for 26 years, with the same controlled quietness that had marked everything else about him. He left no confession. He left no letter of explanation to his children. He left a will that divided the property between Henry and Josephine in equal shares. He left nothing to Pearl. That omission would itself become part of the record. In the fall of 1866, after the courthouse appearance, and before Edmund's death, Nora gave her testimony to Patrick Corbin. She came to Natchez alone. She arrived at the Bureau office on a Tuesday morning in October, the same kind of morning it had been in October of 1847, the same quality of light over the river, the same particular smell of the Mississippi autumn, which is not exactly a sad smell, but a heavy one, layered with the remains of seasons. She sat in the chair across from Corbin's desk and folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at him with the calm and measuring attention